So everyone is welcome. We are welcoming all our comrades, colleagues, friends from different time zones. So it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's yet one more of the other universals event. I mean, at least the reading decolonization aspect domiciled here at the University of Ghana, at the Institute of African Studies. So today we are concentrating on Palestine, placing Palestine within the decolonial discourse, as part and parcel of the global South. And so that if we are going to be taking the decolonial project seriously, then we cannot leave Palestine behind. It's like what Kwame Nkrumah said when in 1957, Ghana gained its independence. The freedom of Ghana is incomplete until the rest of Africa also gains decolonization, also gains its freedom. So today, I will hand over to Dr. Faisal Garaba, who will moderate the rest of the conversation. Unfortunately, we are unable to, Lana Tatu, one of the panelists is unable to join us due to ill health. We wish her a quick recovery. But Faisal will be a moderator and at the same time, like he said, a more interventionist moderator. Faisal, by the way, teaches in the sociology department at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And he convenes the Global Studies program at UCT and leads the South-South Migration and Inequality Hub, also in South Africa. And he's a very good friend and colleague from whom I have exchanged plenty of ideas in the last 3 years and that I have learned a lot really from. And so I'm very, very happy to hand over to him to moderate the rest of this conversation. Thank you, Dr. Garba.
Thank you very much, Chika. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are based. It's really nice to be invited by the Decolonial Futures, the Reading Decolonization Reading Group at the University of Ghana to moderate this conversation. Now, as advertised, the conversation is titled Decolonial Futures, Palestine in and the Global South. We had intended to have a conversation with Dr. Rana Barakat of Birzeit University in Palestine and Dr. Lana Tatur, who is a lecturer in global development at the School of Social Sciences, UNSW in Sydney. Unfortunately, Lana was ill, so she is unable to make it today, but we are glad that Rana is here with us. Now, in terms of the format, I want to begin by talking about the format of today's session. I will begin by trying to frame the conversation in terms of what it means to think of Palestine in Africa today, but also within the context of what is going on in Palestine as we speak. For those of us who have been following the media, there's been a resurgence of Israeli attacks on Palestinians as we speak. And so what exactly does this mean if we think about these questions from an African location? Now, Rana will then speak for between 20 to 30 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have a conversation, basically a chat between Rana and myself, and then we'll open up for the last 30 minutes for a conversation with everybody. I hope that is fine. You are welcome to put your questions in the chat, and when we open the floor, the virtual floor for interventions, please raise your hands and I will call you to ask questions or make contributions. Okay, thank you once again for coming. So why Palestine? What is happening on our screens today? I have been met with this question several times, by my students, by people who say, you are based in this university space. What exactly is happening? What are we seeing on our screens? Of course, the default media reportage is that this is a conflict between two sides, right? Now, inherent in the descriptor conflict is two sides with equal power, two sides who are equally positioned in terms of the historical antecedents that we find today. Another descriptor is disputes. Words are not idle. They carry meanings. They shape the way we see the world. So a dispute, again, connotes an even playing ground, a certain neutral assumption about what people are claiming. Now, some people ask the question, is what we are seeing a case of domination? Is it something that flows out of inequality in access to power, but also in the global political economy and the global ordinal ranking of people, some as more human and some as less human? A consequent question is, what has oppression got to do with this? Now, these are very funny questions. How one sees them depends on the way one sees the world. And so today we will try to understand what it means to think about these thorny questions from an African location. And so the question really that comes to mind for me is, what is it about thinking Palestine in and the global South? And to do this, one has to go back to history a little bit. In the immediate aftermath of colonialism across the African continent, if one thinks of the late 50s, early 60s, especially the 60s, that mass wave of independence struggle, two key issues were on the front burner in terms of the total liberation of the continent, but also what it means to think about struggle. Is struggle bordered, or is struggle a universal human good? The first really was apartheid South Africa, right? For many generations of activists, certainly those who raised us in our political struggles, growing up in Ghana, apartheid South Africa for them was a central feature of their understanding of the world. But also Palestine was key for many of them, right? The question of Palestine meant that when one spoke about internationalism in those moments, internationalism did not end where the borders of Africa ended. Internationalism simply meant, where are those who are oppressed and what do we have in common with them? So Palestine was central to the imaginary of total decolonization. Here one can also think of Western Sahara, and it is part of this imaginary. Now, there's a colleague of mine, Anaid Al-Hardan, who is based at American University in Beirut. We are working on a project called Afro-Asian Past of the Decolonization Era. Anaid and another colleague called Tariq are looking at iterations of anti-colonial struggles, but also moments of encounters between writers on the continent, writers in what one calls the Arab world, but also writers in different parts of the global South, who were trying to find areas of convergence around intellectual production, but also in terms of self-definition that was not bordered by a narrow definition of what it means to belong, as bequeathed by colonialism. And I think this, in a way, shows the limits of the recent understandings of what is happening in Palestine. So in West Africa, in Ghana, for example, and this is not disconnected from the global description, that is led by a certain section of right-wing mobilization, is that what is happening in Palestine basically is a struggle that pitches Muslims against, Christians, for example. Now, this myth serves a particular function because it serves the function of depoliticizing a question of dispossession, and therefore trying to win support by mystifying what exactly is happening. And why is this important within the African continent? It's important because the binary that religion has given rise to, this Islam Christianity thing, means that politics often becomes depoliticized, and morality and very narrow understandings of what it means to act in the public sphere take center stage. So a friend of mine recently was trying to respond to this assumption. He says, look, I actually have never met a Muslim Palestinian. I know a lot of Palestinians, but I've actually never met a Muslim Palestinian. Now, this tells you the limits of this prism, which tries, it's a deliberate thing because it tries to mobilize people using religion, and we know how passionate religion can be in this part of the world. And so really what we try to do today is to begin from history by locating the Palestinian struggle that we see on the screens today from its antecedents. And therefore to ask the question, what would solidarity look like, irrespective of where we are located today? Now, as I said, we had initially advertised this as a conversation between Rana and Lana, Rana with R and Lana with L. The good thing about these names is that it means my R and L don't have to be on point. I can just say Rana where I really meant Lana. I can say, well, it's fine. I'm just trying to say the other person. But today we only have Rana, which name. So Rana is an assistant professor of history at Brussels University in Palestine. Her research interests include history and historiography of colonialism, nationalism, and cultures of resistance. She is currently completing a book monograph titled Lifter and Resisting the Museumification of Palestine, Indigenous History of the Nakba, contracted with the University of Carolina Press for the Critical Indigenities series. The project advances an indigenous understanding of time, space, and memory in Palestine by focusing on the details of the people and the place of Lifter village over time. Barakat also has a second book project in the works, the Barack Revolt, Constructing a History of Resistance in Palestine. Her articles appear in Palestine Studies, Jerusalem Quarterly, Native American and Indigenous Studies, Contemporary Levant, and Settler Colonial Studies, along with other academic journals. In spring of 2019, she held the Akapita Visiting Professorship at the Center for Palestine Studies, Columbia University. She serves as policy advisor for Al-Shabaka. So it is my pleasure to invite Rana to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we have a conversation, then we open up. So Rana, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that important framework. And I want to thank Chika and Faisal for help putting this together, and Andrea, who got this going to begin with. I'm sorry Lana isn't here, but I'm going to try to sort of encompass part of what she might have been, what we had actually planned to be our conversation together. And I do hope that this is the beginning of a long and ongoing conversation, not only with regards to Palestine, but also with Palestinians. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to try to adhere to the time limits, but we'll see how I do. Faisal, let me know if I don't do so well. Okay, in thinking about reading decolonization, as this reading group is described, through Palestine, I am very grateful for this opportunity. And as I just said, I hope it will grow into a generative and ongoing conversation. Allow me to return to the idea of ongoing in a moment, but I want to flag something from the beginning, because what I want to present today are these two concepts that we can hopefully add to our collective intellectual and political understanding of decolonization. One is return, and the other is ongoing. I work on and in Palestine, as Faisal just explained. I teach at Bujazet University, and I live under occupation in the West Bank. This occupation is part of the larger structures of settler colonialism in Palestine and on the Palestinian people. I teach history, and in teaching history, I want to emphasize that we live the past in the present and the present with the past, but we also live to imagine the future. I would like today to have a conversation about Palestine and Palestinians, but I want to ask all of us to take a step back for a minute and think about how to frame our conversation, given what Faisal just mentioned about everything that is on our screens in front of us right now. Given these recent events, what I call the newest iteration of ongoing resistance, it might be useful to see these events, the last month and a half, in their historical perspective. Rather than looking back only at the last few weeks or several weeks, let us try to think about the last month as part of our ongoings. To begin with, as a kind of preface for the before my actual intervention, I think it's important to understand a few basic points. First, Zionism is settler colonialism. This is not something I think I would need to say a lot about in this space, but I would like to point out a few things about which kind of settler colonialism that Zionism is. First, as an ideology, it was born out of and from European modernity. Following a pattern of European colonial modernity, this ideology was about creating a nation state and creating one through settlement. This means, as Patrick Wolf described it in his interpretation of settler colonialism, destroying to replace. From ideology into movement, Zionist settler colonialism found its greatest allies amongst the European imperial powers, and most lately amongst the largest imperial power, which is the American government. While I actively do not want to center this in our discussion, for I believe settlers have occupied the center far too much in our intellectual, social, and political life in Palestine, I do want to emphasize that no discussion can actually be based in history or reality without fully understanding that Zionism as an ideology, as a movement, and finally as a state, were, are, and remain settler colonialism. All efforts to obfuscate this very basic point is a political maneuver to further erase Palestine and Palestinians, just as settler colonialism has attempted to erase our presence in and on the land and in history. Now, this might seem like a simple or basic point, but it is foundational, again, to understanding how to have a generative conversation about Palestine and with Palestinians like myself, and how people choose to obfuscate, change the framework, introduce concepts that purposely ignore how this geography is one of settler colonial violence. This is actually also not exceptional. That's the settler colonialism that works to eliminate indigenous peoples and cultures is not exclusive to Israel or Zionism. In fact, here is one line of many that can be called commonalities with other geographies where people have endured the structural violence of settler colonialism. This brings me to the second point of my preface, which is about British colonialism and imperialism. This takes us a little further back from where Faisal started with the 60s into the first half of the last century. While 1948, the year that Israel entered the imperial annals as a recognized nation state, is often where people begin the story, I argue that while 1948 was a result, it was also a new kind of beginning, but it was also part of the ongoing. Here, let me quickly point out that imperialism has ravaged what can be called the Arab world, as it has all of our geographies. Specifically, the Imperial War, otherwise known as the First World War, drew lines in our lands and created what we call a colonial geographical map. This is obviously not exclusive to Palestine, for it is part and parcel of European modernity and the colonialism that was and is the fundamental machine in that modernity. In Palestine, this was the basis for the British Mandate from 1922 to 1948. This mandate, which is another word for colonial administrative power in the wide lexicon of colonialism, actually began long before the actual colonial administration in 1922. This is the era I study, so I'm aware of how much I can actually say about it, but I'll try to streamline a bit here. And I would like to simply point out a few key moments that can help us along in our discussion. 1917 is the year of the British-sponsored Balfour Declaration. In this one document, the largest imperial power at the time married its intentions in Palestine with the Zionist movement. That is, the declaration that was later integrated into the actual text of the mandate declared its support for and assistance in creating what the official document describes as a Jewish national state in Palestine. Put simply, from 1917 and throughout its colonial administration in Palestine, the British supported a settler colonial movement and reduced the people of Palestine into an unnamed population, officially referred to simply as the non-Jewish population. Here, it might be useful to understand that this sectarian language, as Faisal just pointed out, is that of imperialism and Zionism. This is very important to keep in mind because of the idea of a so-called religious conflict in Palestine is the mythology of settler colonialism. The people in Palestine, along with the political desires of the people on and of the land, were essentially negated in support of a settler movement. Not centuries old, but rather 1 century of settlers and settlement of a modern settler colonial movement. This brings me to my third and final preface point, which is what I called earlier the ongoing. It is, I think, important to read the violence of settler colonialism as ongoing and structural. It is also important to read our refusal as ongoing. Rashid Khalidi in his latest book describes the last century as a 100-year war on Palestine. I would add it's a century of Palestinian refusal and resistance. Here, I think it might be useful to zoom in a little on 1929. Because so many of the events of this past month have centered on Jerusalem, I think it's useful to see Jerusalem over time. The past is very much present if we think about the ongoing. 1929 was the year of the Barack Revolt. Full disclosure here, this is the topic of my first manuscript, and it is a book that I worked on for years. One of the concepts I found fascinating about the Barack Revolt in 1929 is what I've described as the urban fallah, or the urban peasant. Because in the Mandate era, the lived city of Jerusalem and the resistance in Jerusalem highlighted this. Rural and urban blended in a lived way. The people who rose up against British rule and Zionist power in 1929 were these very same urban fallahim, beginning in Jerusalem and spreading throughout Palestine. Like in 2021, in 1929, settlers provocatively and violently marched onto and into Jerusalem's old city, intending on marching to the Barak Wall, or the Wailing Wall, to force change in British policy regarding holy sites. Since the early 1970s, the settler movement has called this the Flag March, but it too has historical legacy in the earlier iterations of the Zionist settler colonial movement. 1929, like 2021, was not the first of these attempts. It was and remains part of a larger strategy of ongoing dispossession. 1929, like 2021, centered on the old city in Jerusalem, but also had to do with the surrounding areas. Attempts at ongoing dispossession in Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan, Lifta, and all of the neighborhoods of Jerusalem are not new. 1929, like 2021, was a mass protest. It was on the streets and it had very little to do with the then and now traditional leadership. From Jerusalem to Hebron, and then to Jaffa and Nablus, like 2021, the Barack Revolt, I argue, was a national uprising. Also, 1929, like 2021, these settlers marched with military protection and carrying a religious ideology that is the mythical underpinnings of a settler movement. It is settler colonialism that makes Jerusalem, like the rest of Palestine, a military zone. So when you see the video coverage of settlers marching, while the scenes are disturbing, diabolical, and obviously violent, remember this is not an aberration. While the chants of death to Arabs are shocking, it is what settler colonialism, what Zionism has always been, albeit perhaps today a bit more exposed. This is a new phase in the longer history in terms of who is in leadership of the settler state. Unyielding and unapologetic fascists have taken center stage in terms of politics that once had at least a slight sense of liberalism. But it is, I argue, also important to remember that whatever seems new about this moment is well grounded in history and 100 years of history. This is one part of the ongoing. The other, and for me, central part of the ongoing is ongoing resistance and refusal. Here I would like to point one thing out and make this an actual request for us. Because of the violent history of settler colonialism in Palestine, we relegate Palestine into this notion of the past, what once was. 1948 is the year of forced removal, where nearly 3/4 of the Palestinian people were violently driven from their homes, creating a new colonial category, refugee, also creating a border. And then 1967 was another violent year of removal, another war, creating another border. We have now what can be described as the fragmented geographies of Palestine and Palestinians. But what this month and a half has shown to the world is what has been called historic Palestine, is what is now being refused. That is, people have pointed out that actions, protests, organization, mobilization, and resistance have encompassed all of historic Palestine, from neighborhoods in Jerusalem to cities and towns within the Green Line, the 48 border, and those in the West Bank and Gaza, 67 borders. I think it might be useful to see this not as historic Palestine, but as Palestine. What is historic is very much present. Also, we've seen Palestinians in all of our many geographies rising up, being heard, being seen, and actively mobilizing to protest. These protests in and beyond Palestine is what we share in common today. Like other popular uprisings, action is instructive. So what we have in Palestine is a landscape of action, a map of ongoing return through, against, and across a map of the ongoing Nakba. So that's the end of my preface, but as a historian, I find myself still needing to draw out the larger and longer lines of our story. And here, to do that, let me describe what we mean by Nakba and ongoing Nakba. Nakba is a term and concept that is now common in use beyond Palestine, so I suspect it might not be new to most of you here. Nakba, as a word, was first offered by Constantine Zurek in the midst of the Nakba War, referring to the war between 1947 and 1949. This war was a war of settler invasion, destruction, and forced removal of, as I said earlier, nearly 3/4 of the Palestinian people from their homes and lands. In Arabic, Nakba means catastrophe. In 1948, from Constantine Zurek, this was a scream. Though the language was new, the scream actually began several decades before 1948, as I just pointed out. Ongoing Nakba is a concept first offered to us by Ilyas Fori to describe all that has and continue to happen since 1948, the continuous violence against the people and place of Palestine. And so the geography of the people and the place of Palestine has endured 100 years of colonial and settler colonial brutality, 73 years of ongoing, seemingly never-ending atrocities of the systemic and structural violence of a settler state. Again, the adjective of historic before the word Palestine, as I mentioned earlier, is an indicator of the effects of this violence: dispossession, forced removal, erasure, fragmentation, elimination, genocide. But frankly, over the course of this last month, in spite of all of this knowing, and perhaps because of it, words continue to fail me. I literally still do not know how to describe the level of violence that we're seeing: unadulterated brutality and wanton murder and massacres, a war from above and from the sea, and a long line of wars on Gaza, where nothing is safe and no one is left untouched. Parades of marauding and murderous settlers, militarized settlers, aided and embedded, supported and driven by the various arms of the settler state's military apparatus, without real or even proverbial red lines. Just 3 days ago, we all witnessed the so-called flag march that invaded the space of the Damascus Gate outside of the old city walls in Jerusalem, and where Zionist police and board guards emptied, this is the word they use, the space for settlers to march. Empty is a violent concept in settler colonialism, as we know very well. As I speak right now, there are more provocations in the old city, more settler colonial violence. And frankly, at this point, it feels never ending. But what the last month has laid bare, and the clarity that has obviously and finally permeated the walls of obfuscation that have long defined how some folks see, or rather work not to see, Palestine and Palestinians. But what the actions of this last month have also shown is the people in and of Palestine resist and refuse. It's also an invitation for us to see a new lexicon, a new language. While it feels like a relentless kind of never-ending violence, it is also ongoing resistance to erasure. It is the dismantlement of power and the act of being in refusal. This is what Palestine has to offer in terms of a decolonial praxis. In this vein, I would like to offer one more conceptualization of the ongoing, which is the conceptualization and the basis for my current book project, Ongoing Return. This too is about refusal of oppression and about practicing liberation, but it's not new. Again, it is also ongoing. Ongoing return is the story and stories, the lived realities of a people and peoplehood, the Palestinian people asserting yet again over and over, our peoplehood. Listening to the stories that are our history over time. Listen to the stories that are our history over time, and it will become quite clear. So now I'd like to turn to Lifta in order to return to Lifta, to zoom in again a bit and see how stories can be the praxis of decolonial thinking. Today I will describe in a little bit how today is a day where you might have seen on social media declared as the day of return to Lifta. It is a day of public and mass protest, and it is centered around this village northwest of Jerusalem. Before I speak of today's actual practice of returning to Lifta, what we're seeing in action, I would like to describe a bit more of my own personal return to Lifta. And I would like to begin with a personal confession of sorts. In Arabic, the word for recognition has confession and acknowledgement embedded in it, i'tiraf. It comes from the etymological root for all things related to knowledge and knowing. This part of my story today is about my grandmother, a grandmother I never knew and am destined to endlessly seek. My maternal grandmother, Arifa, Abdulrahman, Siam. I say her name because it's important for everybody to hear her name. I know her name and have sought her out in every moment of my adult life. She was born in a village adjacent to Jerusalem, Lifta. She married and began making a family for herself in Lifta. In 1948, Zionist military units forced her, along with the rest of the villagers, out of their homes and the life as they had always known it. What we call Nakba was a catastrophe for Arifa. It is the mass expulsion of Palestinians that was inaugurated by the 1948 war, where the Zionists forged to create the state of Israel. But given the settler colonial context, as we know, and as I've just described, the Nakba preceded 1948 and is ongoing. I should add here that thinking about settler colonialism structurally is also obviously about thinking of how to dismantle these structures. Arifa. Arifa's name is from the same linguistic root as i'tiraf, ayn, ra, fa, know, knew, known. In Arabic then, knowledge, ma'rifa, has a guide. Arifa's name is literally related to knowledge. That is, she who is the knower. In my work, in my life, my knowledge of Lifta comes with and through her. She is both the knower and what I seek to know. The journey towards knowing in this context is not dependent on settler colonial knowledge. It is also not a counter to it. This journey of knowing is a path of return, and return is divorced from the ontological power of settlers. In the colonial present and the violence that comes with it, this divorce may be part of the disorder of decolonization that Frantz Fanon described. Undoing the ontological structures of settlers requires the centering of indigenous critiques of those structures. Eve Tuck and Kwan Yang would put it, unsettling this settler power. As they argue, the ethic of incommiserability requires unsettling settler anxieties, performance of innocence, and their need for reconciliation. Decolonization is not a metaphor, and therefore it is not about rescuing a settler future. In Palestine, decolonization moves away from the mediation of preserving a static past within a settler present. It moves away from the settler needs to rescue their own future. It moves instead into a different temporality, where the barriers between the past and present and future are liberated of colonial ontologies. It moves into an ongoing process of Palestinian return. Towards this new approach to methodology, I explore a journey through the past with the present and the future, walking through history on the land and layers of memory it holds for the people in, on, and of Palestine is a kind of knowing that is inseparable from the knowers and she who seeks to know. The journey here is return, not only the physical return, though it is most certainly that, to the land, but also the ways of being that we are and become in and through return, including our ways of knowing and how we engage knowledge of the past, present, and future. This is an epistemological journey towards the ontological imperative of returning to Palestine. Here, I ask, what happens when our journey of return is motivated by a different sense of belonging? This project, this book, Arifa and Mai's relationship with each other, both in the material sense of a book And in the political sense of Palestine, thus, is informed by a simple statement: return is about belonging. Return to not what once was, but rather to what can be. This return is constituted by a simple invitation. Palestine does not belong to us, but rather we belong to Palestine. Belonging here is no longer defined by liberal or capitalist notions of property. Neither land nor our bodies returning are commodities in this invitation. How do we act within this kind of knowing in the face of ongoing settler colonial violence? Gloria Andalusia warns us, quote, "We can't transcend the dangers. We can't rise above them. We must go through them." She reminds us that, quote, "We are not reconciled to the oppressors who wet their howl on our grief," end quote. Excuse me. We are, however, the constant target of settler colonial violence, as our bodies in relation to the land that we belong to are the constant danger from which settler futures need to be rescued. Searching for and with Arifa, through our conceptions of time, moves us away from relations with settlers into our relations with the land. We cannot transcend the dangers of settlers. We endure their violence on the land and on our bodies, but the violence does not define our relation to the land nor our relation to our bodies. This is what I describe as ongoing return. It is the practice of movement and mobilization against colonial rule and oppression. Now, in my project, I work through return by imagining return over time and ongoing. Working in Palestine and on Palestine offers the opportunity to constantly do this work, but it also requires constant amendments. What is most exciting about refusing a lamentation of a static past as a historian, refusing to not only grieve about once was, though to be sure there is a lot of grief and ongoing grieving in our lives, it is that things keep changing. Opening ourselves and our work to the constant change is about not succumbing to colonial order, but it is also often overwhelming. This is what the last month has been for me and us in Palestine, a time of grief, but also a time of the renewal of hope. Today, grief and hope mixed again, yet again, in Lifta. From 1929, that I just described to you, through 1948 to 2021. Today, Friday, the 18th of June, people from all geographies of Palestine that can have reached my family village in Lifta. They are descending in protest of our ongoing dispossession. As I already mentioned, Zionist forces violently attacked and dispossessed the people of Lifta and dispossessed the place of Lifta, her people. My grandmother was forced to flee and live the rest of her life only a few kilometers away in Jerusalem. That happened in 1948. But since then, this dispossession continues. Most recently, as I described in the article circulated to you all, there is a case of ongoing dispossession in Lifta. The update from the time that I wrote the piece, that is to now, is that in the midst of all that is happening in Jerusalem and in Palestine, the Zionist municipality of Jerusalem opened up a tender process, basically opening up a potential bidding war for architectural firms to destroy and rebuild the parts of the village that were not destroyed or rebuilt already. That is Lower Lifta, where 57 structures remain in the valley between two hills. The structures stand, though the people were forced to leave them. This announcement was made in May of 2021. Not a coincidence. This is the same methodology being used in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, and beyond, ongoing dispossession. In Lifta, this ongoing dispossession is also about the idea, for none of us have lived in homes there for 73 years, but the presence of the homes themselves are still a danger to the settler state. So today, it's another day of protest, refusal of oppression, assertion of peoplehood through movement and protest. But for me, there's a bitterness here. Like Arifa in Jerusalem, myself in Ramallah, I live a few kilometers away from Lifta, but I cannot go. I cannot go to Lifta. There are too many militarized checkpoints that prevent movement, my own movement. Today, like every day since 1948, a majority of the people of Lifta and their descendants cannot go to Lifta. The Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, prevents us. But today is also a day where people are returning to Lifta. So I've spent my afternoon watching videos that my students have sent me, following the live stream coverage that they offer on their social media. I've received photos and phone calls from friends and comrades, songs being sung near the village water spring, and I am given to imagine Arifa singing with them. The breaking down of the brutal borders between past and present as we forge collectively our futures. People have descended upon Lifta today. Bread is being baked in a traditional way that no doubt Arifa spent her early life with. This is the bread of life. Photos and videos of people walking in the paths that work like a maze in the lower part of the village. Paths walked by generations before them. We walk in their footsteps towards a future. In each moment is embodied another scream. We are here. We are returning. Our verb tenses actively switch from past to present to future. This is the active work of decolonization. That I cannot be there is the ongoing Nakba, settler colonial violence. That Palestinians are returning there as protest, as resistance, as return is our ongoing return. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rana. So I had no idea that today is such a significant day in the history of Palestinian people.
I should say, Faisal, it's not significant in the history. This is part of this ongoing, this is a mobilization that was called for 3 days ago.
So thanks for that. And I think there's something surreal and somber about the current moment, because as we speak, when one reads of attacks going on, you know, bombs dropping on people. Now, I want to make a comment and then ask a question. And the comment comes from your presentation. The question is linked to your presentation, but mainly out of the article you wrote. So when you mention your maternal grandmother and how your knowledge about where you come from, this village you make mention of, emerges out of, you know, her experience, out of her resistance. And although you've never met her, she, in a sense, is present in the way in which you remember, in the way in which you fashion the present and imagine the future. That, in a sense, leads me to what I think, and I've, you know, had this conversation with Chika and some people in the Reading Decolonization Today group, which is that central to the project of decolonization, of course, is undoing colonial logics and colonial orders, but what exactly is an enduring legacy of colonial orders? I think it's this separation between those who know, those who are human, those who are subhuman. Okay, so you have this broad separation. And part of those who are subhuman, those who do not know, are ordinary people, people who are supposed to lack knowledge, whose memories are faulty and unreliable. Okay, now as a colleague, Isabel Earing, who is in here, I can see Isabel here, and Isabel and I have been having this joke for some time about the neutral, objective white male as the eminent figure, you know, of rightness, of basically moral standing. And for me, this is interesting because it also shows the limit, and I'm here speaking from the African context, it shows the limit of some of our assumptions of what decolonization is and what it could mean, to the extent that it is relegated to the epistemic valorization of the works of famous people. That we also have scholars who can stand to your Hegel and your Kant, right? But to say, but what if we think of knowledge and knowing differently by subverting this colonial formulation of systematized, valorized knowledge? and basically stupidity, which is supposed to be the TEF of the riffraffs, who are, of course, can also be called the colonized. My question is linked to that, and it's about, in your text, for those who have not read it, the text is called Writing with a W and Writing with an R, so Writing and Writing, Palestinian Studies, Settler Colonialism, Indigenous Sovereignty, and Resisting the Ghosts of History. So of course, you began by, showing how paradigmatic the settler colonial framing has been in understanding Palestine, right? And then you look at Baranchin's work, but also where you think the slippery slope, where he sees the pre-68 moment as one which is emblematic of settler colonialism, and post-68 as not exactly that. And of course, you have this interesting critique of Mamdani, when he returned from Palestine and said, look, I think the best way of understanding Palestine is not South Africa. It is America, right? How the Americans dealt with the native question. And your argument simply is this, that by insisting on the settler colonial formulation within the American context in particular, one assumes, because you think that there is a pre-understanding that the settler tribes, the settler wins, and the native is defeated, right? But what you're saying is that no, actually, we have to go to indigenous studies, to borrow concepts and categories in order to have a more, if you like, robust, a more politically aware understanding of settler colonialism. So my question is simply this. Where I'm located in South Africa, for many people, Israel in a sense, Palestine in a sense, defines what they went through, what their parents went through, and the legacies that they continue to leave. So my question is, do you think apartheid South Africa is a useful frame to understand what's happening in Palestine?
There's a lot of questions in that one question, aren't there? So I'll try to take it, I think in threes, not because of Hegel, but because of me. So I'll try to do three different ways of responding, because I think there's a pedagogical question embedded there, there's a research question, and there's sort of an epistemological question. So I would like to just start out by saying that, I offered two of my articles. One is the one that you just described, and the other one is the one that I referred to in my talk, which was published in Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal. And the reason that I mentioned that is because the article that you just referred to was sort of the preface for that article about LIFTA and what I meant by museumification. And that is the way that I think about it, because that article has now become the basis for the current book project that I'm working on. So it is, the call that I make in that first article about writing and writing history is looking towards indigenous methodologies in order to write and imagine our own histories. And what I try to do in the second article is to show how that can be done, as opposed to just deconstructing or dismantling settler colonialism, as you just described. So I think of them as I can't necessarily separate the two of them in my own thinking. So what does it mean to know and know differently? And I think what's instructive for me is what my supposed discipline is, which is history. And the thing about history is that it is, as you described, this notion of human and subhuman, but it's actually about the nation state, right? So history is about documentation, but who creates documents? Who's archiving documents? What history is being related by that? So we can obviously know, we understand the institutional connections between an archive and a modern nation state. In the same way we understand the institutional connections between a museum and a modern nation state. So my turning to Arifa in a way was because I couldn't find her in that kind of history. She wasn't only subhuman, she was completely disappeared, totally erased. At the very most, she could be a number right? Of people who were, who were forced to flee from the village of Lifta. And that wasn't enough for me. That wasn't the kind of knowing that I was okay with. So I realized that I had to turn away from the traditional disciplinary understanding of capital H history and understand that that is part and parcel of modernity, right? And it is informed by the Orientalism that Edward Said gave us conceptually. So then it became for me a kind of, where do I seek knowledge? And that was married to or coupled with what kind of knowledge, right? If I saw the idea that knowledge is only based in certain ways, documentation, these old white men, right? That was me turning away. I'm not saying that I'm not going to read that or I'm not going to, but it's about how I engage that. And those are not the primary sources of my engagement. And again, this is about decentering the settler narrative. So part of it is seeking out Arifa, but also part of it is understanding that I have to think about research in a different way. This is very personal because Arifa is my grandmother. So I started collecting stories that were familial stories, incredibly personal, but understanding that part of an indigenous methodology is this false separation of personal and political, this false separation of rational and irrational, this false separation of emotional and intellectual is something that had been forced on us. And so refusing that kind of force, and then realizing that stories can also be part of my imagination, right? So return is also imagining return. So I imagine an ongoing conversation with Arifa. And that means, I suppose, given that kind of pedagogy, given the kind of epistemological Western Oriental notion of history is fantastic, right? It is a product of fantasy, but it's not. It's a part of me trying to seek knowledge through a different kind of remembering. And so in my book, I talk about this as remembering not in order to not forget, right? It is not about the static past. It is remembering in order to sort of return, right? That is the activism, that's the active component in it. And so that's sort of how I think about my research, or how I've thought about my research. The question that you ask about, the way that I understand pedagogically is how we're teaching, how you're teaching in South Africa and how I'm teaching here. So you're in as equally traditional discipline as I am. Sociology and history, with the addition of anthropology and geography, are the basis of colonial knowledge and forced colonial epistemologies, right? So how do we balance that, right? How do we understand that history is also about stories of the past? And that's something that, the only thing that I would want to say about that today is that we finished our semester and I'm about to hand in my grades. And today my mobile phone burned up with all the photos that they are now former students of mine were sending me, because they were able to actually physically be in Lifta and they wanted to share that with me. So I think I'm incredibly proud of that, because that's not about a grade and that's not about the capitalism of knowledge or the corporatization of neoliberal education, which is a problem for all of us, but it is about how we shared knowledge and rediscovered our own kind of knowledge over the course of the semester. And then the last question you asked, which is what you described as the question, is apartheid in South Africa. I think of course it's useful. I think part of why it's useful is how incredibly rich our history between South Africa, rich history of solidarity and shared political notions of liberation or getting free. There's no reason that's there for a reason, obviously, right? That's a shared political project. And I also think that, using apartheid conceptually in Palestine is important. It cannot be the only way that we understand this, though. It is part of a larger understanding of what settler colonial violence looks like. So my commentary on Mamdani in the article that has grown into a larger commentary on his most recent book isn't that we can't learn from a shared political vision or understanding of the geographies of North America and Zionism, what white settler colonialism looked like in North America. I think we can, but when he says that, he's making the assumption that one is in the past and one is ongoing. And what I'm saying is that they're both ongoing, and I think that's also an important political praxis to have. Now, sharing these ongoings is also really important, because the fight in South Africa isn't over, right? Obviously. and I think it's a misnomer to say that, racial apartheid versus political apartheid versus economic apartheid, separating them is actually, I don't think, for me at least, helpful. And I'm here to learn if it is helpful politically or not. And I think the easiest way to answer your question is to see the kind of like how mobilization happens over time and has happened over time in South Africa with regards to Palestine. BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign, was born out of a shared understanding of what happened with boycotting apartheid in South Africa, and it is sistered between Palestine and South Africa. And we're seeing this happening. We're seeing some of the largest marches that happened in the last month were happening in South Africa. As far as the global South goes. So of course it's useful, but I do think it's important to understand the specificities, but we work through those specificities in order to nurture our own commonalities.
Thank you very much, Rana. So we have exactly 30 more minutes, which we have allocated for conversation with everybody on the Zoom session today. I can see the first hand. So please, if you have a question, raise up your hand or put your question in the chat box. So the first one,
I'm sorry to interrupt because I can't raise my hand because somebody sent me a direct question while Rana was speaking. And I think it's a very intriguing question.
So wait, just hold on, Chika. Hold on. I'll come to you just a second. Okay. So yeah, so those who have questions, please put it in the box. If you cannot raise up your hand, just like the person who sent the question to Chika. So Chika, you can ask that question on behalf of the person who sent the question to you, and then we can take those who have sent who have raised their hands. We're going to take 3 to 4 questions at a time, depending on the load of the questions. So Chika, go ahead.
Thank you, Faisal. I'm sorry for barging in. I couldn't just raise my hand. I didn't realize the host can't raise his hand. So this person is asking, I think the question is directed to Rana. Would you say Palestine is in a subaltern position? I asked mainly because for those of us who go to school in the West, now pay attention to the reason why I said this question was very intriguing. Criticizing anything Israel or standing up for Palestine comes with consequences. The effect has been silence, as I observed. Do you think the silence will be lifted if Palestinians like yourself have more chances to speak to the world? Because a first step towards achieving justice, to my mind, is having allies or having a chance to listen to the other side. So the very fact that the asker or the questioner couldn't even post it to everyone, more than performs the question itself.
Okay, Chika, thank you very much. So the first hand I see here is Jonathan Bildo. Forgive me if I do not go according to the order, but I'm just going according to what I can see. So Jonathan, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jonathan.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Rana. Thank you, Faisal, for the presentation. Actually, I'd like to borrow from Faisal's contribution of question, which suggests that religion can polarize us. And in the midst of that, how do we imagine solidarity? And I think one of the dominant issues in religion is eschatology. That is, the place of Israel in Christian religion, the place of the afterlife or what have you, in Islam as well. And it is in this question or in this theological discussion that is dominant in Christianity, especially the American inspired version of Christianity, that's the role that Israel has to play in the life of a Christian. And what I'm not aware of is, the eschatological discussion in Islam. So if we have to imagine solidarity, then the decolonization has to more or less confront this discussion, this theological question.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. You are done, right? Or did you go off? Hi, Jonathan.
Or view of eschatology in both Christianity and in Islam as well.
Jonathan, I don't know if you are done, but we've lost you. So sorry, I will quickly go to the next person, but I think Rana has gotten the import of your question. So we'll take one more question before we go back to Rana. Nana Yao, Miracle. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
All right. Thank you so much, the decolonization team, for putting this wonderful session together. And thank you, Rana, for your presentation. Thank you, Garba, for your insight. So there are two things basically that I want to put across. So Israel has no constitution, since it became a state. And the argument has been that it is still in that process of continuation. So they don't want to be in that rigid position of having a constitution. However, there are a number of initiatives, there are a number of laws, right, that have been initiated and implemented, at the national level. And it ties into Rana's question of her project of return. Now, Israel has, in 1950, Israel implemented what they call the law of return. And just in 2018, they have the basic law. And the law of return basically says that every Israeli has the right to return to Israel at any point in time for automatic, citizenship. And that is in particular reference to only Israelis, right? In total disregard to non-Arabs, Palestinians. Now, it is even interesting the way the topic for this discussion is formed. Obviously, there is the absence of Israel in the topic for today's discussion, but the elephant in the room, or what we are discussing, significantly concerns Israel. And then we have the basic law in 2018 that automatically makes Hebrew, that automatically declares Jerusalem as the complete capital, and a number of policies or laws that basically, at a first glance, makes it a racist state, projecting discrimination to its highest, level. And so I'm trying to understand how, you cannot, and this is a reference to what Garba said concerning Mahmoud Mandani's work. I'm trying to understand how you can draw a correlation between apartheid South Africa, right, and what is happening, to Palestinians and Israel's also Palestinians also in Israel. I'm trying to understand whether it is politically healthy, to try to distinguish, to try to say that one doesn't provide support to the other, or that these are binary opposites and not something that is similar in so many aspects. And then again, I also want to find out from Rana, this project of return, right? How is it feasible if you take notice of the many laws that have been implemented at the national level and accepted by the Israeli parliament? The basic law and then the law of return. How do Palestinians seek to navigate around these kind of basic laws and at the same time ensure a decolonial agenda, of return, right? So I just want us to have this at the back of our mind. Secondly, now it is still a symbiotic relationship. We are talking about decolonization, right? South-South cooperation. My understanding is that Israel also provides critical coordinates to appreciating critical, critical race theory, right? It takes us away from what Paul Gilroy creates an impression of an Atlantic hegemony of Black diaspora. I think Israel also provides important, or what you call critical coordinates to appreciating critical race theory, and understanding that Israel can Israel as a state, as a state for Jewish people, right, in its sense of the word, can also help us to appreciate, right? It can help us to what Siam Zaleza calls de-Atlanticize or de-Americanize, the hegemonic Atlantic Afro, studies, because I'm sure Rana would understand that if you go to in the state of Israel, moving away from the Palestinians, among Africans, right, there is some kind of racial hierarchy, amongst Israelis, among non-Israelis, that is Arab Palestinians, amongst what they call Ethiopian Jewish, and then the other African communities. So within the Israeli state itself, there is a very important structural racial hierarchy that can provide us important critical coordinate to understanding and appreciating critical race theory away from the Atlantic hegemony. So, I mean, if you are talking about, decolonization and South-South cooperation, we must also think along these lines. I don't know if I'm able to put my thoughts and questions, across.
Okay, thank you very much, Nanayao. We will go back to Rana and then come to Abdul Karim, and then we read the questions in the chat. So if you have questions, please raise up your hand. If you want to type in the chat, please do so. Rana, over to you.
Okay, I'll try to be as quick as possible to give other people a chance to ask their questions. So I'll begin with the question that that was asked about whether Palestine is in a subaltern position in the academy. I think, obviously in the academy, in the context of Europe, in the Anglo-American context, and even continental Europe, of course it is, in the sense of we're seeing this actually play itself out in the new legal definition of what anti-Semitism is, based on the IHRA definition, which is kind of an equating between Zionism and Jewishness. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and to call it out, actually. And I think what's really important is that Palestinian voices have been silenced, obviously, historically, and they continue to be silenced. And people that are in solidarity with the question of Palestine are also being silenced. And there's a great deal of repression that comes along with that kind of political positionality. But it's also important to see how things have changed over time as well. And I'm not being overly romantic in saying this, but I think over the course of the last decade, we're seeing a significant change because of a number of things. One is that the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, has actually grown remarkably. In North America, you're seeing the US, United States ACB, US ACB, as a part of the Palestinian PACB, which is the framework for the Boycott and Divestment Sanctions campaign. And in the most recent iteration, you're seeing the kind of what I noticed was a really remarkable change was the amount of solidarity statements that came out of organizations, departments on campuses. And so these kind of solidarity statements were not just individually signed, they were collective solidarity statements. So you're seeing the gender studies solidarity coming from gender studies and not just people. The American Studies Association had an incredible solidarity statement, as did a number of other associations. So the idea is that I think the best way to sort of deal with that is, and I'm not in that position. I'm in Palestine, so I can't speak to what it is like to be in that position. But I think what's really important is that you're seeing voices stronger and more collective. And that's not to say that there's not repression. Obviously, there's still a great deal of repression and a great deal of erasure and silence. But the idea of the collective is born out of, I think, the different ways that we've gone about thinking. So this kind of connection between indigenous peoples, for example, there are shared political commonalities. You're seeing this come out of a lot of people who work in this field. So is an academic still prone to repression? Obviously, yes, but I do think that that's also something that we need to and can connect collectively work on, and we're seeing that happen. And we have seen that happen. With regards to the question about religion, So, Yani, religion is, as Faisal mentioned, one of those, what did you say, Faisal? It was one of those things that bring about a lot of emotion. I think what I said, it wasn't even in the subtext, but what I tried to be somewhat ambivalent about in my presentation was that I took as a starting point that everybody in this room would understand, in this virtual room, would understand that Zionism is this is why I emphasize the settler colonial. Zionism is settler colonialism, and that religion is a mythology that was used to rhetorically carry this settler colonial movement. And we're seeing that's obviously not something that is exceptional to Zionism. What is a bit different is that this is what is called the Holy Land, put between quotes. So the Holy Land has had contestation about who gets to control it and who represents it. It is, as Edward Said argued, it is one of the main pillars of the production of Orientalist knowledge. So I'm not sure. I'm actually thinking aloud with you now. I'm not sure it's really useful to talk. It's important to recognize how the role of religious mythology. It's important to recognize how religion plays a role in belonging, but it's belonging to a place. But it's also important to recognize how that is abused and manipulated within settler discourse. With regards to, my first book, which is on the Barack Revolt. So it's, Barack, I named it the Barack Revolt because that is in the Haram al-Sharif, in the old city of Jerusalem. It is what is called in what Jewish people, I don't mean to say Zionists now, called the Wailing Wall, and what Muslims refer to as the Barak Wall. So there is a great deal of religious mythology in Islam that is connected to Jerusalem in particular, and the Aqsa Mosque. Even more specifically, it was the first direction of prayer and is the third holiest site in Islam. And that is significant. That is significant in the sense of, I've lost sense of time and a tracking time, but I believe it was May 10th, when people saw on their television screens or on their social media, the Israeli army going into the holy space of Haram al-Sharif, which holds these three mosques, in particular, the Golden Dome, right? The one that everybody can probably imagine in Jerusalem, and the Aqsa Mosque. This is sacred space for Muslims. And they were throwing sound grenades, they were arresting people, they were desecrating sacred space. They were actually going into the mosques themselves, not just the area in front of it, the mosques themselves. That was incredibly disturbing. And I think it was part of the optics of how disturbing this last iteration of violence has been. So that's the second question. And the third question is actually about so I don't think Israel is the elephant in the room. I think I just, I think I was clear in understanding that I don't want to center everything I say on settlers. But that doesn't mean that I don't, settler colonialism and the settler state of Israel, but that doesn't mean that we can understand what's happening without understanding the violence of settler colonialism. So you're right in saying that within the Israeli settler state, there is a law of return. The return is not for Israelis, though, it is for Jews, right? So this is the actual specific. Israel as a state and Zionism as an ideology has attempted to become a representative of Judaism and Jews in the world. There's a whole lot of refusal amongst Jewish populations globally to that kind of representation, especially as it's grown over time to be the kind of state that it has become. But there is, obviously, upon the creation of the state of Israel, and in this quest to represent Judaism and Jews, there is this idea of a law of return. And embedded within that law of return for all Jews worldwide is that any Jew that is considered a Jew. So this is where the surveillance and the power of the state. So the state decides who is a Jew and who is not a Jew, right? This is the first of many, not the first, this is one of many problems that are involved here. Are given the law of return is actually seeking more settlers, right? That's the idea of needing to understand Zionism as a settler colonial movement. So it is called the law of return, but it is an invitation for further settlements in Palestine. And as you rightfully pointed out, you can bookend the law of return in 1950 with the nationality law in 2018. And I wish Lana was here, because this is stuff that Lana actually writes about along with apartheid in a far more sophisticated way than I have of describing it. But you're right in that the nationality law of 2018 is actually the codification of apartheid, where not all, first of all, not all people on the land are citizens, and two, not all citizens have the same categorization or the same rights. And within Zionism, and this is something that I think you have read because Lana's pieces did get distributed. Okay, I'll finish. Lana's pieces did get distributed, was that there is this deep understanding. We can learn a lot about racialization if we understand how Zionism and the Zionist state actually performs part of the violence of settler colonialism here is the racialization of their own citizenry. And that includes, the kind of racism against, there's this idea of the Israeli as the white Ashkenazi European descendant Jew, and then everything else that follows after that. So I'm not sure actually that I do understand and I respect and appreciate what you were talking about with sort of locating this differently. But if we're only thinking about Zionism and the Israeli state, I think it is very much mirrored on a kind of apartheid and racism that we're seeing in other settler societies, including North America. And I just want to, as I see that Faisal's telling me we're running out of time, I just want to interject one other thing, is that is Zionism, right? So those are and that's important to recognize that obviously there's a great deal of racism amongst settlers against settlers, right? We see this. We saw this 3 years ago now in Tel Aviv with the kind of violence that was enacted upon Ethiopian settlers that are here, right? You see this every day in Jerusalem in the same way. But we cannot, I don't think, read that outside of the larger framework of settler colonialism. This is what I meant when I responded to Faisal's question about, yes, apartheid is a component of understanding what's going on here, and it's one that has a lot of traction politically, but the larger framework for what's happening here is settler colonialism. And there's no reason to not think about apartheid within that framework. I was running.
Thank you very much, Rana. So we will go to Abdul Karim Ibrahim and then Shaira Vadasaria. So if there is anybody who wants to ask a question, please indicate either by typing your question in the chat or raising your hand. So Abdul Karim.
Very well. Thank you very much, Faisal. And of course, thank you so much to Rana too. Lord knows how much I am interested in this subject. And this is the first time I'm getting to actually interact with a Palestinian and somebody who lives everything that we get to understand through the news. I have just two quick things. First would be more or less a contribution, and it is still on the essence of apartheid, South Africa, and what lessons that could be for all of us. So growing up in Ghana, going through school and all of that, I never really encountered the case of Palestine in my curriculum. What I got was rather through the media and the news. So I'm thinking that, especially as Faisal also talks about the religious division that we see here, I do believe, and this is not to speak for the Palestinian people or even Rana in this case, but for Africans to realize and appreciate the problem even more, I am thinking that the issue of South African apartheid in South Africa could be a more relatable concept that will help people to appreciate and understand this issue even far better. But to my question, so I want to ask Rana, for people like Rana who are academics and also activists in this essence, where do you place the Hamas question and the militarization of the struggle, especially within the context of international law and the asymmetrical power relations that exist? Because oftentimes, and especially for many who are not so invested in this and have no idea what exactly is going on, when the issues come up in the news, what they very readily get access to is the fact that Hamas sent in rockets indiscriminately here and there, blah, blah, blah. And so how do you, as an academic, address that element of militarization of the fight back, really, and within that particular context? I'll be very happy to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdul Karim. Shaira Vadasaria.
Hi, thank you so much, Rana. I learned so much. Am I on mute? No, I learned so much from you when I hear you speak, and the article that you wrote on writing right Palestine studies. I feel like it was such a paradigmatic shift for people, for me, I can say, in how I approach Palestine studies and think about epistemically, where do we put our focus? And I have an analytical question for you around the question of race and how we think about this also in relation to Palestine and in relation to Palestine studies. So my first, I have two interrelated questions. One is around the politics of refusal. And I've been thinking about how the category of race, what it means in different mobilizations of refusal as it comes up in Black and Indigenous studies. And I think we see it kind of, I think we see a lot of common ground around the mobilization of refusal, what it means. But I also think there's differences to pay attention to with regards to how the question of race comes up. And I think it's also a question then we need to attend to as it emerges in Palestine studies, right? So my first question is really to just think with you on that, of how do you see it? And the other thing I'm curious about these days is I've been noticing the invocation of anti-Palestinian racism more and more as a framing, as a way to name and identify racial violence against Palestine, against Palestinians, and those that are allies of Palestine. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are and what kind of conversations have been going on around the usage of this, because I guess the caution also is, similar, okay, now I'm gonna go, similar to your cautions around centering settler colonial studies to think about Palestine versus Indigenous studies. I've also been thinking a lot about what happens as we invoke critical race theory in Palestine studies, and what are the cautions we need to think about around that as well. And so then this concept of anti-Palestinian racism, what does it do? What does it not do? Yeah. Okay. I stop there.
Thank you, Shaira. So I can't see any hand, and I don't see any question in the chat box. And we have, 3 minutes. So,
Faisal, I saw many questions, a number of questions.
No, there are comments in the chat box. There are no questions.
Oh, yeah.
Comments. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I will hand over to Rana, but Rana, this is not a question. It's a semi-question from me. So really, I want you to reflect, in closing about, what will solidarity look like, irrespective of where we are located? Yeah, thanks.
Okay. That's about as existential a question as one can be, Faisal, just as a quick ending question. Thank you for that. So I don't think I can actually do these questions justice other than to, just to sort of force myself into this reading group, basically, and have this be an ongoing. And I do hope that that we'll get more Palestinian voices within this group and other groups like it. Because with the acknowledgement and respect that this is, the location of Africa is important for this reading group, I do think that we can, and it would be generative to think together. And I think that's an easy way of answering your question of what solidarity looks like. It's how do we think together, and who we're engaging, right? Like who we are engaging, how we're engaging them. And I'll use that as a means to sort of speak to the other questions, although I can't answer them entirely. There was a comment in the chat I'm sorry, I didn't write down the name of the person that said it, and I can't look it up right now, but that was in reference to Saidiya Hartman. And yes, I'm very influenced by her Wayward Lives. And I'm very, as a historian, she was and remains one of the people that I think, whose work I think with. I don't know her, but she's one of the people whose work I think with. So it is, speaking to what Faisal was talking about with what kind of knowledge and what's the point of remembering and what are we remembering. With regards to Abdul Karim's question, I do agree with you. I do, and I hear you, especially on the continent, thinking that South Africa is a useful way to sort of understand politically the struggle in Palestine, and thinking of the struggle against apartheid as a productive way to politically mobilize. And I think that that's really important. I think it's really useful. Again, it's Lana, if she were here, she would have a lot more to say about apartheid because she's written about it. My only just interjection in that, and it's not a hesitation, it's just an introduction, is that there is a certain way of understanding settler colonialism. I referred to Patrick Wolf twice in my commentary, and I see that a good friend of mine and a comrade, Kahelani Kawanui, is here in the audience, and she writes about this a lot. I think it's important to understand how Zionism as settler colonialism is a settler colonialism that is built on elimination. So there is this notion of, there is obviously over time a kind of apartheid is a part of one of the many tools in the toolbox of settler violence in Palestine. But I think it's really important to understand, and that does not mean that there is not a conversation here. Obviously, that doesn't preclude a conversation. But understanding that Zionism, the kind of settler colonialism that Zionism is it's about elimination, I think is a specificity that does not prevent a conversation. But it is one that I think that we need to acknowledge and work through, particularly with regards to South Africa and the kind of colonialism and that brought about apartheid in South Africa. Again, it does not preclude a conversation, it just makes a more robust and interesting one. With regards to Hamas, I think, I understand the point of the question in that, how do we respond to people, right? I think that's I don't mean to put words into your mouth, but how do you respond to people who are based on this corporate Western media version of what Faisal was talking about as the conflict? How do we take that apart? And I think the easiest way to take that apart is the way that the tools that we have in understanding decolonization is that focusing on Hamas as violence is actually reifying this notion of settler innocence, right? If we put it within that framework of what settler innocence is, we understand why that kind of framework exists, right? Why that people are saying that. That's not to say that I can't, there's a lot of there's a lot of details that one can go into when talking about that, but that is the overall, I think, framework that is useful for talking about that. And what's more is, it's enough. I think we have, in this South-South connection, I think we are now at a point where we no longer need to, one, prove our humanity because of the dehumanization of colonialism. I think I'm done with that part. I'm ambivalent about feeling the need to prove my own humanity or my people's humanity. And two, to apologize for resistance. I mean, resistance and refusal. We are in the midst of an ongoing settler war against the indigenous population of Palestine. To focus not on that and to see Palestinian resistance as somehow categorically terrorism is obviously reproducing the kind of frameworks that are settler colonialism and Orientalism infused. Finally, Shaira, thank you for what you said in your very generous comment. I'm humbled by it. I'm not sure I agree with you, so I will just say that I'm humbled by it with regards to that one article. I think, you were thinking aloud, so I'll think aloud with you. I don't have any answers to your questions, but I do think that I would like to point out a few things. One, with regards to indigenous studies, is that the article that I like the best is actually of my own work, is in Native American and Indigenous Studies as a journal. That is the conversation and the space for conversation that I have sought out and that I found an incredibly productive, generative, and generous space to be in. My book, which is in progress, things keep changing. LIFTA is once again on the map, and so I have to reevaluate the way I'm thinking about things. It's exciting, but equally overwhelming, as I mentioned, is run through an Indigenous Studies series, Critical Indigeneities. So I think, you know, basically just how my own work is being engaged is in that space. And I think that space is a very generative space, and it's a very generous space, and it is indigenous. I'm not claiming indigeneity in Palestine. I'm not working through that. I'm working through an indigenous methodology. I'm not saying that that claim isn't valid. It's just not necessarily something that I'm doing in my work. And I'm finding, I don't want to say an audience, I'm finding comrades, I'm finding a generative conversation. And the same is true in Black studies for different reasons, right? In a bit of a different frequency. I think we have to be careful though, again, with regards to the specificities, right? Not all Indigenous peoples are in the same place and space, culturally, politically, socially, and that's something that I think Indigenous studies folks understand and are working through with regards to Palestine and conversations with Palestinians. And the same is true of how we think about racism in Black studies. Now, with regards to anti-Palestinian racism, I'm actually not sure about that one, to be honest with you, because it's pretty new, right? There's the anti-Palestinian I get, and maybe the racism part is something that I can learn more about. But I do think that there's something really important in thinking about understanding sort of the frameworks and how they work. So Zionism is fascism, and Zionism is racism are things that we've worked through. Right? This is 3 generations now of scholars who have worked through this. That is within Zionism and how the categories of race have worked within Zionism, right? That's about Zionism, but we don't want to center that in Palestine studies. So how do we understand that kind of violence and how it is part of the settler colonial violence within Palestine studies? But I think we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful and understand that that is Zionism, right? But we also have to be careful about understanding how racism has worked in our part of the world, including the Arab culture, Arab and Islamic culture. Take heed by that, acknowledge that, understand the longer histories of that locally, and understand that within Arab culture, within Arab history, because we don't want to exceptionalize Palestine within that context. And then understand how racism in that context, right, within the context of Arab history has worked. Right. And I'm careful about that because it is a history that is local. Right. But then I'm also thinking about what you were talking about with, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement put out one of the best statements that, you know, a really courageous statement in the last month. Right. So there is obviously a political solidarity with what Black Lives Matter means, and a political solidarity that goes back 2 generations within the context of Black radical movements within Europe, North America, and the UK, and understanding those as conversations, but not necessarily having to have the same definitions for the categories that exist, or not even having those kind of categories, but respecting and acknowledging and honoring the political commonality and solidarity that comes from that. So this is an ongoing conversation, Troya.
Thank you very much, Rana. I want to read out a comment from Nanaya Omreku to sum up what I think has been your contribution. Nanaya says, "Wow, Rana, thank you for your appreciation on the issue of settler innocence." So I joined Nanaya and everyone on this Zoom session to extend our huge appreciation, you know, for the clarity of your presentation, but also the political message. You know, if I want to describe it, I would say it's been a tour de force because, you know, historians are often accused of not being very good in predicting the future. But I think you've given us outlines of what solidarity could look like going into the future. So thank you very much. I think this is only the beginning of an ongoing conversation. We had a meeting yesterday and we agreed that in future, we will have another iteration of this. And thanks a lot to Chika and the Reading Decolonization in Africa group for this opportunity. So I'll hand over to Chika, having done my job, I hope satisfactorily. Thank you.
More than satisfactorily, comrade. And
Chica, if I could just say one thing, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to thank you personally because you and Andre are the one that brought this together. And Faisal, we are actually acting solidarity right now. This is what solidarity looks like. So I want to appreciate that and thank you all for this. And the ongoing, I'm not going to stop talking and I'm going to bother you guys over time. So that will be ongoing solidarity. So thank you personally, Chica.
Yes, and I'm tempted not to say anything after this because everything has been covered so well that any other addition might just be to spoil the mood. So I'm so grateful to you, Rana. I mean, Faisal, Andrea for starting it all, and all of us who have created the time to participate in another online event. You know, it's almost like a zombie outbreak nowadays. You know, just the sheer numbers of all these online events. So if people are able to create time to attend one more of those, it's only proper that we are grateful. We thank you for making it. We will come back. Maybe not this month anymore, but we will come back with another event, not just on Palestine, but we are thinking of an event on bringing a seasoned lawyer to lawyer, you know, like lawyering decolonization on the continent. And so we are thinking of something like that, especially in the context of higher education. So be on the lookout for an event of that nature, where we will try to bring the legal dimension to the issues and problems we encounter when we try to talk decolonization. Especially, I'm particularly drawn in by that question by someone who was worried about what might happen to him or her, you know, if they just talk about, you know, just to talk about Palestine, you know, or to criticize Israel, even in the university. So maybe it is a good tone, I mean, as we taper off with this event, to begin to think of the legal dimension to lawyer decolonization. Thank you, everyone, and we shouldn't take any more of your precious time. We'll see sometime. You can say hello to comrades. And so
applause for Rana.
Hey, thank you.
Yes.
So you can
Thank you,
unmute and say, greet people, and then we are off.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye and thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice sharing. Thank you so much.
So off we go finally.
Yalla. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.